Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to take this chance to welcome you all to this channel. I am Professor Silas Odongo, and my channel is Professor Silas Odongo Knowledge Hub. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to kick off a presentation to you aimed at giving you some information and building your capacity around climate change. This presentation today is centered around the introduction to climate change, variability, and I also want to use this opportunity to strike the nexus between climate change and development. Lastly, I would also wish to share with you a bit of climate change impacts per sector, and I want to be as general as possible, noting that we might want to have it applicable to the various sectors where we belong. Now, climate change is a subject that people keep talking about today, and it is something that many people understand, while some people don't understand it. But it is closely connected with the idea of weather and the idea of climate. If you look at weather, for example, you talk about the changes in those parameters like rainfall, temperature, and humidity, often within a short time, like a day or so. But then climate would be average weather conditions of a place, which is considered over some time. And so those kind of elements that we talked about weather are the same ones that we use to describe climate change, like temperature, humidity, air pressure, the cloudiness, wind, and precipitation. We talk about rain and even snow and all that. So understanding the climate patterns is important, or understanding even the weather and everything is so important because it does shape what we call the natural ecosystem. And you know, ecosystem comprises of a great deal of things. The human economies depend on it and everything. And what we know up to now is that, and we have this from various evidence sources. So initially, look at the weather and even climate and all this. We used to have what people could describe as more or less stable climate. But currently, climate that we are experiencing is very dynamic, very prone to variability, and also change. And future climate is not even predictable because we have so many people predicting that what is likely to happen in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years or so. So we also have predictions. But then if you go into records, you check to what extent are predictions that people have made, be they scientists or lay people, have they materialized? So we are living in a world of uncertainty with regard to climate change. And this climate change we keep talking about, the science, pure science, has been able to attribute it to a number of factors. We have the natural factors, and then we have the human factors. And earlier scientists from World Meteorology Organization and the formation of IPCC being Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and even the formation of UNFCCC, United Nations Framework on Climate Change. They did a lot of studies, and they principally blamed climate change on human activities, what we call anthropogenic factors. And these factors, or this problem you're talking about, could have originated some time back. If you remember the time of Industrial Revolution and the growth of the big economies that we have today. Just imagine what could have happened. Industrial nations have continued to emit. In a bid to develop, industries have to really work, and when they work, they use input or raw materials, and the output is most likely carbon dioxide or gases that we call the GHGs, the greenhouse gases. Some are also called the heat-trapping gases that we have. So the high accumulation of these gases in the atmosphere is what has resulted in what we call global warming, as it were. I would be able to describe how that process happens. And climate change that we are talking about, which is resulting from a buildup of greenhouse gases and heat-trapping gases, has caused a lot it has had more negative impacts than positive. I'll be able to mention a bit about positive. Generally, if you look across, and the evidence that shows climate change has happened could be the rising sea levels. Talk about this. Look across the continent of Africa, across the world generally. Melting of snow and ice. We used to have mountainous regions where we could have the ice. We no longer see them. More extreme heat events, even in places, even in countries of the world that was not within the tropics, nowadays experience heat events. Even countries that were largely on tropics sometimes today experience wet situations. You can only attribute it to that. We've been able to have incidences of outbreak of fire and drought, floods that maybe just come to a place where nobody has ever experienced flood before. Look at even changes in precipitation and rainfall. So we could be talking about seasons. The normal season, maybe one season in your own country, and then immediately we have two seasons, or we don't have dependable seasons at all. We talk about drought, the famine, the plant and animals are having issues like diseases, the changing seasons. So things have really changed. So climate change affects both human beings in terms of human health, and affecting forests, affecting aquatic life, even agriculture and agricultural production. It also affects the freshwater supplies. Even if you go to the oceans, the coastal areas, look at the coastline and the impact that climate change has had. Now, since many kind of systems rely on climate, and you can imagine what systems are anchored on climate, if there is going to be a change in climate, then it means many related aspects of where and how people live, even plants and animals, will suffer. So that's why we always would say that climate change is not arguably what you would say is positive. But then the positive sense is connected with development. So when climate has changed in a place, a lot of efforts, I would call strategic efforts, policy efforts, communications effort, and resourcing will go into that place, and it ends up changing things. And I remember that is the only incidence when people have been able to think like climate change is having a positive impact. So climate change and variability, we talk about variability to mean a short-term change or a short-time change. That is it. But climate change, for you to make a case that it has changed, then we look at about 30 years. So if you do an analysis, you use maybe time series analysis, maybe you check between this year, and hopefully maybe 30 years, you see things that have changed. So now, why is climate change an important thing? Why am I talking about climate change to you people? I'm doing this because climate change affects people and affects everything, including livelihoods. So it affects entirely aspects of people's progression because it leads to death. We have instances where it has led to death. It causes poverty, drought, depletion of even natural resources that we know. It has led to poor health, lack of sustainable ecosystems. It has made people to change even lifestyles, and the social life is not what we used to be. If you ask anybody around you to kind of give you evidence that climate has changed, people will tell you stories that will eventually tell you, inform you of what that indeed something has actually happened. So then climate relates directly with development. And what could development be? Look at development and we think of a process of improving human, animal, and plant situation. And it is a positive process. So you can only say development has occurred if what you have seen is an improvement. It's positive but continuous. Maybe it is not just a one-off kind of thing. And if you take the systems perspective, we all are knowledgeable about systems thinking or the cybernetic thinking. The development is an improvement of the general situation of an ecosystem or a system and even elements of that system. And it results from very deliberate actions of people, of a person, of communities, or even of authorities. And development is so multidisciplinary that you may not really only see a thing and it has improved, and you quickly assign it or associate it with development, as it were. So it takes quite a number of variables for you to say that development has occurred or hasn't occurred. And that's why we have the dimensions of development. We know a lot of them, like economic development, we have human development, we have sustainable development, we also have territorial development. Probably the one which people know a great deal is economic development. By the way, when you talk about development, people think about endowment, goods and services, entitlements, things like that. How we generate new goods and services, and how we provide additional consumptions and investment possibilities. Those are the things that people talk about. So economic development is traditionally believed to be one of the first form of development. And normally, people use metrics like gross domestic product, gross national products, and per capita income to be able to design or to describe and explain economic development. That's what we are talking about. And many scholars have also worked around development, and they are able to pinpoint even some of the activities or processes that they think add to economic development. To give you just a few of them, if you look at Schumpeter, 1911, for example, he says that for somebody to think that the development is economic in nature, then something like innovation and new ideas. So if you see new ideas and innovations, something like that. Ramsey, 1928, proposed that economic development relates with the endogenic means, like increasing savings, for example. So if you save, you earn and save for some time, and you have surplus, then that would be associated with that. Scholars like Allais, 1947, proposed the length of working time. So if you have longer work time, then somebody would quickly may associate that with that. Solo, 1956, it talks about the increase in capital and laborers. So if you have enough resources and you also have laborers, what will the result be? Probably the result will be development. And look at Roma 1986, for example, introduced the idea of new technology, equitable resource distribution. Look at all that, and replacing physical resources with human development. So there are a number of scholars, a number of philosophers who have actually lent some ideas around development and its constitution. Currently, development is supposed to be understood within the confines of integration, that I'm talking about. So, for example, you look at scientific thinking around that and the lay knowledge and how people characterize development. You can look at that. The second one is human development. This is a development centered around human beings, and the focus is on improving aspects of the well-being of individual and society. If you give people good health, provide people with education, provide them with capabilities or entitlements, or if you empower people, then that is human development. It kind of puts a premium on the knowledge and skills. If you generate knowledge and provide skills and expertise, and you protect the sources of knowledge to enhance that continuity, then we will be thinking about that. So it's assumed generally that human development, which is centered around knowledge, is very central to even socioeconomic development. Why do people go to school, for instance? We know so many people who have gone to school, and their schooling has helped change things, probably giving them, improving their capacity, the thinking capacity, so they are being able to have options. Or when somebody has been educated, they get jobs. So proponents of this kind of development, human development, they argue that knowledge leads to empowerment. It also leads to self-reliance or improved community, and things that we know that. Even social relationships. So you begin to look at development as a whole world of interdisciplinarity, as it were. If you spotlight UNDP 2010 and how they define human development. They say, for us to talk about human development, you have things like long and healthy life. If you have long and healthy life, you have knowledgeable and informed society. Knowledgeable society and informed society, a bit of literacy. And if you have a high sense of life, then if you have social cohesion, if you have political cohesion, all these will, to a large extent, increase life expectancy, even years of, and then ultimately, even per capita, there will be some level of sustainability. So then we have a third one, which is sustainable development. Sustainable development is a relatively young concept developed by Brundtland in 1987. So he says that sustainable development is one approach to development that actually meets the needs of the present generation without interfering with the ability of the future generations to succeed or to continue living. So look at it. If you have, for example, climate change happening today, and we retain business as usual until climate change ends up eroding or negatively impacting our ecosystem and eroding everything, where will the future generations source their livelihood from? If you minimize the use of exhaustible resources that we have, we don't have endless resources, very few, but we learn how to use them in a manner that reserves them to be used even by future generations. That kind of thinking is sustainable. It applies to many areas, like even in the energy sector, the level of sustainable development there, like oil and oil products. Look at that. The fish and their products, the wildlife and rare fauna, forest and rare flora. If you look at all that, water resources, land resources, and air and atmosphere. So all those areas, we still apply sustainable development. And you can quickly isolate activities or processes that are sustainable and those that are unsustainable. So if, for example, we would look at these practices like land degradation, for example, soil erosion, land salination, you look at air pollution, waste dumping, depletion of fish. If you were to use a means of fishing that gets all fish from our waters, you have deforestation, you have overmining. You mine until there is no more natural resources, and those ones are quickly labeled as unsustainable practices, and they are connected with climate change. So then we could also think about practices that are sustainable. We can talk about techniques for sustainable development. If you look at soil conservation practices, so that refers to agricultural practice to a large extent. Good agricultural practices like gaps that we have. They talk about reduced energy usage. So if you have a mechanism of trying to limit the excess use of energy by even relying on natural systems, then you'd be talking about sustainable development practice. If you have wastewater treatment frameworks within your neighborhood, then you can be talking about that. If you have reusable, renewable energy, you use biomass, solar, and all those renewable energy sources, then there's no time that they will be limited. You can use them and then reuse them time and again. Climate smart agriculture, and ecosystem-based adaptation, and all those. Those are some of the practices that we normally say are very sustainable. And if you look at environmental management, look at social sustainability, if you look at economic sustainability and even financial sustainability, all these areas are areas where sustainable development can really be important. The fourth one is territorial development, territory development of a specific region or space, and you always achieve this by exploiting resources in that place. And there are different approaches to it. And you can even have institutional direction, authority guiding it. Sometimes there is system-wide development, and we can have it happening in rural or happening in urban setups. It can be about production and consumption. So it includes quite a lot. But you look at the connection of culture and social life of community, the transport and infrastructural systems that we're having. And we're linking that territory, that system with national and supranational systems. We can look at it. So we can deploy even those approaches we have talked about, the top-down, bottom-up, and in collaborative approaches to institute and run territorial development. And sometimes it is, to a large extent, a result of a government policy, or even in the national policies. You remember we talked about INDCs, we talked about the NAPAs, so you can imagine those kind of things. If we have a marginal area, there can be a policy to develop it, which is government. Or we could have a community themselves trying to lead a process of bettering their life situations. So development has got mainly those four dimensions. And agents of development are there. Development is not what we can say God-given. People must work towards it. And so we have agents, those people who cause development, or those people if they stop doing a thing, then development can happen. Like we have individuals, we have local communities, we have national government, we have international agencies, we have even NGOs and CBOs and FPOs as agents of development. So in terms of development, something has to happen, or something has to stop happening for development to be realized. So those are agents of development. So these agents will do something or refrain from doing something in order to cause that development to happen. And in climate change that we are talking about, this development revolve around the climate responses, like adaptation and mitigation. How are those also development? So if you could commission adaptation responses to mitigate the impact of climate change and to restore sanity. And even as this happens, so the area gets changed, gets developed because of that. And so it also depends on a number of things, a number of factors, socio-political, economic factors that we are talking about. So development happens through a number of approaches. So we talk about the top-down, bottom-up, collaborative. We talk about regional, intergovernmental, the technological approaches to development. And if we deploy those, we can realize development. But development cannot happen outside if certain enabling factors are not in place. And there are factors that influence development. I just mention a few of them, like the fact that development is a complex concept. People don't understand it. There's a time when somebody might be doing well economically, so we realize economic development. But then they forget that there are other dimensions that must also be looked at to constitute holistic development. Diversity of countries and country experiences. So then countries don't develop uniformly. And this depends on the country orientations, their diversity and their experiences. We also have the philosophical orientations. Look at the West, look at the North, and look at Africa, Asia, and the development philosophies they embody. Some are collectivist, some are individualist, and you can see that. So if a country is collectivist, so what it believes is development differs from what that other country that believes in individualism. No, geographical location is another important factor. Polity and the geopolitical factors. We look at the geostrategic factors are also important here. The degree of social and ethnic homogeneity. And the development agenda and approach that is taken. So you can imagine all those things. If we were to realize development, what factors do we encourage? Or in countries or in places that are underdeveloped, what factors are playing against them, for example? So we have also underdevelopment. So we know if we have development, we can also have underdevelopment. Like if you overuse exhaustible resources, if you overuse them, particularly if they are exhaustible, you may end up not having those resources, and so there will be underdevelopment. Look at carbon emissions and climate change, for example. If climate change is allowed to go the business as usual way, unmitigated, then we will lose out and not have development. So we will be having underdevelopment. If we have a general and political instability, we know countries, regions that are suffering from political and instability and widespread inequality, even those inequalities, poverty and insecurity. Look at that, diseases and poor health conditions. Those are important factors that lead to underdevelopment. High illiteracy levels, environmental depletion and pollution, if you look at all that. And then, what it describes a holistic development, what we call ingredients of development. I want to quote the Aquila Declaration, and this is a declaration of the G8 meeting on global governance and food security. So this meeting of the G8 called the Aquila Declaration highlights certain conditions or certain ingredients that must be addressed for us to talk about development, like economy-wide growth. If you are to talk about development, there must be aspect of economy-wide growth. You cannot say development is happening when only an aspect is growing. We must realize some equity and equality. Increasing agricultural production and productivity. Agriculture becomes a cornerstone of development. So if agriculture is not doing well in any country, you can imagine, you can hope that things are not doing well. We have small-scale industries. If we support small-scale industries, development can be assured, a holistic one. If we promote and protect local innovation, what are we able to innovate? If we protect them, if we continue to innovate, and if we practice the transfer of clean, low-carbon technologies, look at that. If we develop human capital, particularly through research and capacity building, if we go doing this, then we'll be sure that we'll be having a comprehensive development. If we open market, free market, so that we can have international trade, then we can assure that. If we have social protection mechanisms, like the safety nets, if we have them. So if you look at those ingredients that are described in the Aquila Declaration, they talk well about the conclusivity of development, economy-wide growth, production, agricultural production, small-scale industries are promoted. We have clean carbon technologies and we are promoting it. If we develop human capital through research and capacity development, if we open free markets so that we can have international growth and trade, if we have social protection mechanisms, then we are actually talking about what constitutes effective and complete development. Ladies and gentlemen, let me take you briefly through socioeconomic impact of climate change. So how does climate change impact our society? I think we have been able to mention this. I said at the beginning that climate change negatively affects communities, environment, and livelihood. And it affects a lot. If you look economically, it does affect gross domestic product. It affects gross national product. It even affects the per capita, so that people live below $1 or even $2. It negatively affects the society. And the impact of climate change is more in developing and the least developed nations as compared to developed ones. So, but then everybody must really work towards improving life circumstances. So you can imagine that. So if you look at sector-wide, if impact of climate change, you look at the agricultural sector, for example. So how does climate change affect the agricultural sector? Its impact can be seen in the quality, in productivity, yields, and diseases, for example. So you realize we have low yields or poor quality of produce. The productivity is not measuring up with what it used to be. If you go to fisheries sector, for example, the low catches, fishermen. In the agricultural sector, I think we have mentioned that. In human health sector, we have had incidences of tropical diseases on the increase, like malaria. We've also had human-animal conflicts or human-human conflicts, and we had a lot. We've also had an impact on ecosystem and biodiversity sectors, extinction of animals and plants. I think this has been there, and quite a lot. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I want to summarize by saying that there is a connection between climate change and development, and you can see that climate change negatively impacts development. The only positive thing about climate change is when the development, when the interventions come to a community to address climate change, that community can grow, and that's what we have been able to talk about here. But then we've been able to strike that connection. So climate change and development are very related, and climate change negatively affects development. And I've gone to also mention to you about the sector-specific impacts of climate change, and we've been able to run through agricultural sector. We ran through other sectors like the ecosystem services, social sector, the health sector. We mentioned all that, and I've been also able to tell you something about the various dimensions of development, how they connect with climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to stop there, and I want to encourage you that you don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to my channel, which is Professor Silas Odongo Knowledge Hub. Thank you.